Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Off the Guardrails by Bearlair64. Dimitri peered into the ever-darkening gloom as twilight faded into early evening. The day had become overcast and gray, and despite the spring flowers that managed to eke out an existence along the narrow shoulder of the roadway, and various verdant hues of new leaves attached to the sparse trees and brush, the landscape managed to appear dreary and forlorn. Perhaps it was the bleak outline of buildings in the near distance, the encroachment of humanity into a tiny stretch of nature that stubbornly remained along Little Jordan Bayou. He switched on his wipers as the rain, that had threatened for most of his journey, finally arrived. The wind had whipped his car the entire time, tugging him towards other vehicles, the verges of the roadway, and buffering his small car so that he managed a tight grip on the steering wheel. They considered that the intermittent gale spread pollen and growth despite the dead covering of concrete and asphalt. The fierce winds now drove a heavy downpour, and sheets of rain accompanied each blast of air. He slowed as the water scrubbed the last of the yellow-green pollen from his vehicle. Ahead he caught sight of yellow reflectors. He knew that the guardrail for the bridge that spanned the bayou, once a small river, was festooned with various rectangles of reflective yellow, red, and white, and dire warnings of ice that might form in the winter months. His vision stared as bright lights that rode high above the pavement and wide apart on a large frame roared directly towards him. He could make out a red cab in the feeble light available. The lights had crossed into and remained in his lane. He flashed his bright headlamps and slammed onto the horn to no avail. At the last moment, he ditched the car into the opposite lane to avoid the imminent head-on collision with the far heavier and larger mass of metal that hurled onwards, its driver oblivious to the elements or the roadway or anything other than the amusing text his girlfriend had sent him. Dimitri felt the various impacts as his car slammed into the guardrail. It was an older one. It had fewer crumple zones, and more of it sliced into his little roadster than would be the case with newer models that were designed to absorb impacts. He found himself falling, then landing and rolling for an inordinate amount of time. He finally came to a halt against the heavy roots of an ancient willow far down the embankment. The world went monochrome for a period, then washed through the shades of gray before it finally began to resume normal hues, and sounds once again penetrated his ears and alerted him to life in the world. He truly awakened to excruciating pain in his chest and left arm. The arm quickly began to go numb, and eventually the misery in his chest faded to a dull throb. He found that his left numb arm would not cooperate, despite direct orders, so he used his right hand to open the driver's side door. "Must have been laying on it. It's getting tingly," he mumbled. The hinges of the little car squeaked in protest that they had been strained and beaten unreasonably. He got his left foot out of the vehicle and into the mud, then stopped for a moment to inspect his situation with his other senses before he touched anything else. It was full-on night, so he must have been down there for a while. The rain and wind had blown on other climes. Then he listened. There were no noises from the highway above. He looked to where he assumed the roadway rested, but it was no longer visible in the wan light. The hideous yellow-orange glow that typically washed out any natural view of the night sky anywhere near the city was not present. Instead, the vault of heaven lay above, painted with a dizzying array of stars, unlike anything a human could have witnessed in this century, or for most of the previous one, at least near an urban center. The moon had not yet risen, yet the streaming stars above offered sufficient light to see that he was in a gully that included a small watercourse along the bottom. Trees pressed in closely in every direction. He felt the lightning of adrenaline cause his heart to cease, and then to flutter, and to momentarily to pound, startled from a tremendous hoot, 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 hoot sounded from the branches of the nearest forest giant. A screeching sound replied from further within the boles and branches. It sounded almost like, "Ryan! Rye! Dimitri!" He shivered, and then shuddered. His bones racked together painfully. "Time to get help," he muttered. "No sense sitting here freezing." His already quiet comments faded to mere thoughts. "It's spring. I remember the temperature on the screen above the speedometer read 74 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite the storm, it was a warm evening. A warm front had caused the winds and the rain and the flashes of lightning. Now it felt like late autumn or early winter. Freaky. He found his voice once more. "It's like I've switched to another dimension, or maybe another time." Definitely something odd. The hoots sounded once more, then something slid from the tree and flapped its way onto the nightscape. It was large enough to create a star shadow as it passed over his head. He hunched momentarily and then exhaled and forced himself to clamber to his feet. The only flashlight he had was integrated into his phone. He bent back into the vehicle to search for the thing, but it escaped him. The various detritus that tended to collect in a vehicle was now strewn over the entire interior space. "I need a light to find my phone so that I can have a light," he grumbled, and then laughed at the absurd thought. He found the device wedged between the passenger seat and the center console. He retrieved it hopefully, then saw that the screen was shattered. Then he saw that his finger bled from where he'd cut it on the shards of the screen. The feeble light that emanated from within the once vivid wallpaper was now too faded to be of help except in total blackout. He didn't anticipate one of those, but he tucked the device into a pocket in case the tracking function might still work. "Gotta keep it dry or the insurance won't cover the damage," he assured himself of his firm reasoning. "Wonder if they can track me if I'm in another universe." He grinned to himself as he made his way down the large creek. "Not with my crappy service. Can't even get a signal downtown." The water ran swiftly, and swirls on the surface indicated a strong current. He decided that if he attempted to cross, he would have survived the crash, only to drown. He turned upstream and struck out for a bridge or fjord. Maybe I just got down deeper near the bayou. Maybe got washed downstream. A bridge would be this way, I think. Maybe shook a few jars off the shelf in my mind, as Granny used to say. He noted that the trees had grown even larger and incorporated tremendously thick trunks. The night noises had grown from impinging noises to a cacophony of bellows, roars, grunts, calls, screeches, and screams. At first he held some hope that they were normal sounds from the nearby roadway and civilization, such as it was so close to urban sprawl. Yet the sounds were definitely organic. Yes, that's the word I want. The other noises covered the first hints of a new set of sounds, but eventually he detected rustling in the underbrush. Something followed him, kept perfect pace from within the verge on the upslope side and a bit behind. If whatever it was attacked, his only escape route would be to run for the river, the deep and hard-flowing river. He decided to temporarily slacken his speed to discover whether the party that followed him would slow as well. His walking pace reduced to an amble, and the rustling branches and leaves slackened their pace as well. He rapidly increased to a fast exercise pace. The rustles now included the thumps of heavy treads as the thing that followed increased its speed to keep up with him. Dimitri became increasingly concerned. It hadn't attacked. Yet. He slowed back to his normal pace, and the unseen tracker slowed with him. Now, heavily panting, he found that he too panted. The numbness in his arm had been replaced at first with tingling, and now with the normal warmth and flow of blood within. He worked his arm vigorously for a moment to ensure that he should need them. They would properly function. He looked around for a weapon in the dimness. He had to maintain focus on the ground ahead to keep from tripping, so he was able to keep an eye out for a handy fallen tree limb or a nice fat rock. Figures, he spat. Nothing handy when it's needed. He noted that for a moment after he spoke, the noises from his shadow had halted. He decided to try a new strategy. Hey! Hey, you! Get out here! Leave me alone or I'll call the police! He shouted strongly and pivoted to shout the last part towards his pursuer. There was relatively silence for a moment. The other nearby night noises ceased along with that of rattling plant growth. Then a loud rustling commenced, and the sounds of which rapidly diminished into the night. Dmitri smiled as his triumph over adversary and resumed his trek. He soon realized that there would be no bridge ahead. There was nothing to indicate the intrusion of humankind into the wilderness that now surrounded him. He noted a yellowish hue that had entered the atmosphere, low on the horizon, and soon happily faded to silver as the moon rose above the tree line. With the bright orb above, he was able to stride with more confidence. He realized he hadn't had to dodge many objects on the trail. Then he realized that he was definitely on a trail. Something, or more likely things, had tromped along the watercourse until there was a reasonably clear pathway. It had to have been fairly large, tall enough to crop some of the higher limbs above as it meandered along, likely taking detours for drinks of water. I wonder what animal would be that tall, he said aloud, as much to keep the riotous sounds at bay as to express a cognate thought. About that time he tripped and nearly stumbled over an item on the ground. He caught his feet on the other side and turned to curse the object. When it moved, it slithered forward along the ground, and a large creature entered the water. It disappeared into the flow of the stream, sinuous curves and coils that went on for far too long. Dmitri watched, frozen in fear and wonder. Must be an anaconda. Invasive species. Nothing else that big. He muttered rather than speaking loudly. No point in drawing attention to myself, he decided silently. The enormous serpent, or whatever it had been, was gone, he hoped. He was doing well enough on the exercise, not too tired, yet he was going thirsty. He shuddered. Not going near that river water. Presently he encountered a small streamlet that led down towards the deeper flow. The water was surprisingly cold and tasted like it was fresh from a modern cooler. He drank his fill and sat beside the rivulet for a moment. He still didn't know where he was or what exactly had happened. He began walking on impulse, not his normal style. Still, he felt strongly that he was on the right path, quite literally. The cold water and the unexpected chill in the air brought on a desire for sleeves. A long-sleeve shirt or light jacket would be great, he pondered the non-existent items as he resumed his march upriver. The uproar of night noises had not calmed. The variety seemed to have changed to larger voices and fewer voices. Ahead and down near the riverbank, he heard a hiss, cough, that reminded him of a steam train in an old movie. Similar emanations followed the initial version, and the air was filled with the noise, then splashes and rustled brush as something ascended the bank in the night, and an enormous something that scraped along the ground and thumped its pedes into the ground in a near charge. Dmitri feared that the charge was towards him, but a new horror emerged from the nearby bowls that ran beside the river trail. The trees and brush crashed aside as the land behemoth charged forward in answer to the challenge from the riverine beast. Dmitri thought at first that the trees, or at least their trunks, had come stomping to life on their own, and then he realized that what he saw was titanic, columnar legs that supported an enormous swaying gut that dangled just above his own height. He had no idea what the creature was, only that its head towered even above the bloated body. The creature from the dark water reached him even as he attempted to take in the sight of the tree legs, as he dubbed the forest giant. An armored beast with low-slung head shuffled past him, its tail dragging behind. Others of its ilk followed. He knew that they were some kind of crocodilians, or maybe outsized monitor lizards, far bigger than the Komodo dragons at the zoo. He remained frozen as the parties met and clashed. Despite the additional light provided by the moon, he couldn't see much. The figures involved were too large for his limited field of vision to process. Something impacted his lower legs just below the knee, perhaps some wagging tail or sudden displaced log sent flying. What concerned him was that when he impacted the ground, his breath fled from his lungs and he found himself tumbling towards the water. He came to rest with only his head in the water, his shoulders in the muck along the bank, his chest turned upward and heavy. He observed the opposite bank from an upside-down perspective for a few moments. A large pair of red reflecting eyes beneath a beetling brow obscured his view. He decided that he had enough. He was no coward, but this was simply too much for a normal human mind to manage. So he checked out for a while, and things went dark. Just like after the crash. He wasn't out for long. He could still hear the roars of rage and fear and perhaps injury from the trees above the tops of the bank. The gargantuan struggle continued, its hideous combatants nothing more than brief, shadowy blurs of animalistic speed, backed by purpose. He rolled onto his anterior and lifted his upper body to gain a better view. His new friend with red eyes was not immediately visible, but a new set of eyes had appeared. Smaller, likely younger versions of the crocodilators, swam towards him, clearly in search of a meal. Dmitri was reasonably fit for a city dweller, but he found that in that moment of horror he was able to leap to his feet and flee up the river, follow the mud and sand that lined the body of water, rather than climbing the bank. Then he recalled the enormous snake, even as he heard splashes and hisses behind him, along with smaller thumps and scrapes than those created by the creatures that had climbed the bank in pursuit of whatever the tall and fat thing had been. He jinked up the embankment so that he could peer over the top, yet not truly up there alongside the bigger monsters. The rustle of brush and the snapping of a set of jaws that contained peg-like spikes of teeth encouraged him to reach his personal all-time land speed record. Despite the lopsided terrain, the slight change in direction threw off his pursuers just enough that they seemed to come to the conclusion that there was easier prey to be had. They did not run well along a slope. They were designed to travel only up or down one. By the time Dmitri's body informed him that he must slow or fall, he had long left his hungry followers and had made significant progress along his original trail. He slowed and cautiously observed the area from above the bank. He detected no immediate threats, and the bank had begun to grow steeper anyway, so he clambered above once again and searched for the trail he'd followed. He could not find it. Apparently at some point it had either veered or outright turned from its original direction and into the forest. He considered backtracking, but the thought of the monsters caused him to shiver. The night had grown noticeably colder. He was nearing exhaustion, and his mouth and throat were dry as cotton. He forged his way through the brush that now impeded his progress beside the running water, until he discovered another clear stream from which to shake his thirst. Then he looked around for a sheltered spot to rest. His stomach growled a little to remind him that he had not had food in some time. He didn't see many options. He'd always heard that it was dangerous to camp alongside flowing water in case of flash floods. He was more concerned about big lizards and hefty snakes. Probably leeches and piranhas in that nasty water, not to mention flesh-eating bacteria and disease. He spoke aloud, seeking comfort in the only human voice available. He examined the trees. None was large enough to avoid the attention of the big, fat, long-legged beastie, but he sensed that it had likely been an herbivore. He would definitely find no safety on the ground. He soon spied a tree that was not exceptionally tall, but it branched nicely. He should be able to climb it and lodge himself in the crotch between the tree limbs that continued to rise. It was below the level of the treetop grazer and above the reach of the swimming crawlers. Probably. He hoped that they could climb no better than regular gators and crocs. He managed to get into the nice fork and settled in more comfortably than he had imagined possible. The ambient noises that had assaulted his ears since his arrival, he decided to call it, had calmed slightly. They were still present, but it seemed that many creatures had either eaten or been eaten, and no longer joined in the orchestra of madness that had haunted his perceptions with the music of death, dismemberment, and devouring. He began to consider his situation, where he was, perhaps when he was. This place appeared much like an archaic earth. Then he slept. His dreams were punctuated by even greater horrors than he experienced while waking. The imaginary beast that came to eat his dream self loomed large and gore-soaked. His dream self was impotent when it came to challenging their intentions. He ran as he had while awake. He felt thorns shred his flesh and sting and burn. Hot breath assaulted him from behind, and he turned to feebly attempt to stave off his impending status as a meal. Then he awakened screaming in extreme pain and discomfort from several places on his body, all at once. He all but fell from the tree, in his haste to reach the ground. There he rolled in the dirt, yet the biting and stinging insects continued their assault. Finally, with no other resource to halt the attack, he rolled down the bank and into the muddy water. It was a rapid roll, and the bank was steep, and he ended up further out into the current than he intended, if he truly intended anything other than to escape the misery that his body had become. He found his feet and began to strip off his clothing and toss it up onto the shoreline. At last he was able to view the members of the attacking force. Some kind of large, stinging ants. They were bigger than any insects he'd ever seen, at least in person. They had red bodies and bright yellow heads. He noted on one of his arms had latched onto his flesh, and with its mandibles and now worked the stinger on its tail in a painful dance that burrowed almost as deeply as had the tiny jaws. Ants with tails? His subconscious interrupted his agony for a too brief interval. They appeared to be some kaleidoscopic amalgamation of ant, scorpion, and spider. He slapped at the offending subject, and then slapped and scratched and rubbed at each of the others he could reach. He ducked below the surface of the water and continued his contortions until he could feel no more bites or stings or creeping of the little feet. When he finally rose and sputtered, he found that he'd drifted even further into the stream. He was moving back downriver. "Away from my clothes," he spat, and he struck out swimming for the shore. He made it. The river current was strong but slow. He found that his clothes had been invaded, and he ended up dunking them in the murky water to remove the last of the trespassers. He hoped vengefully that they could not swim. It didn't matter. His body was on fire with the wounds he'd suffered. He dragged his damp garments and miserable carcass above the edge of the embankment and collapsed on soft, cool grass. He could no longer see the moon. "How much longer will this night last?" he called out to the sky, with its bright myriad of stars that displayed the Milky Way in all its glory. "Am I still in the Milky Way?" He shivered and lay in abject misery, flesh feeling as though he'd been singed by 100 cigarettes all at once. Somehow he managed to doze. When he awakened, it was the continued burn and itch that inflamed his skin. He felt hot and chilled all at once and knew that he was feverish. He wondered whether the insect bites contained some type of venom. "Probably just my luck," he slurred. His tongue was swollen and his eyes gummy. He felt a little out of breath. He located the stream from which he'd drunk during the hours of darkness. When he managed to pay attention for a moment, he noted that the gloom had faded from black to slate gray. It wasn't much for a change, only enough to notice. He rolled into his back, weak and in no condition to condition his headlong flight to nowhere, he mumbled. He opened his eyes to the glare of sunlight as it threaded a perfect pathway between the leaves and branches and found its way onto his right eye to bore into his brain. He rolled onto his side and slurped at the water once more. He kept his eyes closed. They were gummier than ever. When he pried them open, he saw that another party had joined him for a morning drink. They were red deer, speckled with greenish-yellow spots. They were normal size, as far as he knew. The largest peered at him, prepared to leap away to safety should he pose a threat. The others took turns watching as the big one took its turn drinking. Once they were each satisfied, they pranced away into the depths of the green wall of vegetation. "Good thing for you, I feel like crap. Stupid deer. I'd eat you!" His voice was back to mumbles and slurs, and a weak and weary feeling eventually enveloped him, so that he slept, despite the pain, the stinging, the burning, the fever, and the profound chill. His last conscious thought came unbidden and unwanted, yet true to know he felt at that moment. "If I die before I wake." Thanks. When he again awakened, the sunlight was gone, replaced not by darkness, but simple, cloudy gloom. He lay still for a long while, blinking occasionally, his eyelids feeling like sandpaper, his throat parched and tongue beginning to swell with thirst. Great. Nothing ate me in my sleep. I'm starting to be afraid that I won't die. He slithered to the little, live, cold stream and gulped so much water that most of it came choking back and left him in even more misery. With the working of his sore muscles, when he'd done and the racking coughs had faded, he took another drink, a slow one. He discovered that he'd made it to an uncomfortable kneeling position. "Guess it beats an uncomfortable laying one," he groused. With his body attended as best as he was able, he attempted to engage his mind by observing his surroundings. In the now feeble, watery light of day, he saw and heard no exceptional threats from the crowding trees of the forest. When he looked to the river, his heart leapt. It was a major body of water, in the moon and starlight. He'd assumed that he'd simply been unable to see the other side that was cloaked in darkness. Now he could see it, a distant opposite bank, covered in swirling mists, with a dark outline beyond. Definitely not the river I was about to cross when in that truck. He trailed off and shook his head in an attempt to clear it. Instead, it brought on waves of dizziness and nausea. Stupid ants, scorpion, spiders. He cursed the insectoid army that had easily won victory over his mass. Maybe it's a lake. I think they dammed the river above the city. My memory is foggy as that opposite shore. He was back to mumbling with no better trail and no desire to backtrack. He forged ahead along the river to the now impossibly wide river. The noises of the previous night had become muted and merged with birdsong, yet they persisted. Life, and the ending thereof, just beyond the verge and out of sight. The birds were sometimes pleasant-sounding, but most were raucous in their calls. Buzzards and crows, no doubt. Carrion eaters. He shivered, which hurt his sore body. He knew that he needed food. His stomach no longer grumbled. It had lost the capacity. His pace was slow and stumbling. He couldn't decide if it was hunger or venom or fatigue, but he was weakening swiftly. Then the rustling resumed. The sounds that had haunted his tract at the outset resumed. Maybe. These sounded like something a much larger creature would make. They lacked the slight thumping quality of the previous scraping gait. They padded like a predator. He soon caught a whiff of a carnivore stench from the woods to one side. He decided that yelling would not likely stop whatever the beast was. He searched desperately for some type of weapon. There wasn't even rocks to throw, at least not on top of the bank, he realized. Then he searched for an access to the river, down the now tall and steep boundaries of the shoreline. The rustles increased in volume and frequency, and he found himself plunging down from above and impacting the cold water. His feet encountered a muddy bottom sooner than he expected, and he fell forward. A roar sounded from above, and a larger splash doused him with a heavy wave. His pursuer had leapt out much further than he had. Dmitri made his way to his feet in the shallows. The water rose no higher than his kneecaps. He desperately wiped at his face and eyes to clear his vision. A bulky form bobbed to the surface. It swam for a moment, then clearly rested its feet on the bottom. It was large enough to do so in water that would be well over his head. Indeed, the shaggy, slimy pate that rose above the surface was very large. Too large. His poor, tortured senses informed him. The cranium was broad and heavy, with thick jowls that promised enormous biting force. The lower jaw rested beneath the surface, but the bite radius would be impressive as well. Dmitri had no idea what the creature might be. It huffed out a foul, reeking breath that bubbled and frothed the water. Then it began to surge towards him. His body, given the primal option of fight, flight, or freeze, selected the worst alternative. He froze where he stood. The charge of the beast, only just begun, halted just as suddenly. The beak-like mouth, edged with serrated teeth, had clamped onto the rear portion of its body, possibly on a leg or tail. The monster bellowed its outrage and pain and whirled faster than anything that size should be able to. It gaped to expose its fangs and slammed its open maw into a long, sinuous neck that was attached to the head and beak, and presumably an enormous submerged torso. Dmitri, at last freed from the spell that had left him bound and awaiting death, selected a better option and fled. The benefits of the option soon failed. He reached the steep wall of mud and clay and could not climb the slippery slope. He soon found himself coated with the viscous, orange-red gunk from which the nearby landscape was formed. He desperately searched with his eyes to find a place to climb. The combatants in the water continued their titanic struggle. He was afraid to watch. He knew in his heart that, whichever won, he'd be its next meal. He found an elderly log from a tree that had long ago tumbled over the edge of the short cliff, as though it had been toppled just for his needs. He glanced back over his shoulder, and while he couldn't be sure, it looked as though the beaked terror might be gaining an advantage over the wide-gaping horror. He turned back to his task and prepared to climb like a squirrel. He stepped on a rock to give himself a boost, but the rock shifted and slipped into the river. Legs, a tail, and a head emerged from the rock, and it transformed into a very large turtle. Dmitri now sat in the mud, legs spread and hands sunk to his elbows, barked out a laugh. He followed it by more uproarious and inappropriate jocularity, until he had finally stopped to catch his breath. He looked over to where the monster had been so vigorously engaged only moments earlier. The water had grown as still as running water did. A large portion of it had darkened with crimson. A lean, hairy belly flopped to the surface. Long legs disappeared into the depths of one side. At least 3 of them. The 4th was at the moment sliding down the long gullet, well past the beak, and on its way to the invisible stomach below the surface. The head of the dead beats had turned so that it faced into the channel and away from Dmitri's view. He was relieved. He made his way to his feet, and with a wary eye on the feeding riverine nightmare, he cleaned some of the slipperiest ooze from his arm and hands, then resumed his scramble to safety. He continued along the difficult pathway that he had forged for himself until he came to a dip, at the bottom of which was a clear-flowing creek. He made his way down to the water's edge and drank greedily but carefully. He found a deep spot at a bend in the course and washed away as much of the current mud as he was able. He was wearing out quickly and decided that following the trailless riverbank was leading him nowhere. He determined to change direction and follow the creek. He was cold, and the shadows below these fairly low and gentle sloping banks were deep. However, though it must be getting on towards evening, he noticed that the light had increased slightly. He continued for a way, and then ascended the bank opposite the one he descended earlier. The tree cover had thinned substantially, and he could see clearings covered in grass peeping from beyond the boles. He had no way to know whether they were natural clearings or something created by intelligent hands. He didn't care. The trees had become oppressive, so he plunged ahead and soon found himself in a large meadow. There were more trees beyond it, yet they possessed a different quality. There was no sense of impending doom lurking beneath their gentle canopies. He hadn't proceeded far into the meadowlands when he noted several heads that rose, appeared, and disappeared. Each face gazed at him in curiosity and concern. They were large heads with lumpy, elongated faces. He tried to ignore them and hoped desperately that they were grass grazers and had not given to trampling trespassers. He passed, and the heads popped up less frequently. On his other side he saw dark, humped ridges that parted the tall grass, and from which shorts and grumbling arose. "Herbivores, please," he pleaded internally, afraid to make noise. Shortly past the halfway point in his crossing, he darted a glance down one side of the new tree line. Grazing from the treetops, he saw something that may have been the same type of beast that had loomed in the night. The legs were the same, columnar shafts that supported wide, swaying bellies. Necks rose far above what looked to be armor, like that of a rhinoceros. Dmitri shook his head in wonder. He couldn't believe that even the enormous crocodilians could take down such a creature. When he finally approached the area where the grasses thinned and the trees became once more frequent, he realized just how exhausted he was. The sun was sinking fast, and he could not think of a place to shelter. He got a giant deep within the woods, dancing sparkles that hinted of diamonds. He plunged ahead, making his legs work on sheer will. He wasn't sure why, but he knew it had to be something. The diamonds were soon joined by sapphires and rubies, a veritable treasure trove of shining jewels. As the gray slate of night began to descend, he found himself once more on the shoreline of the river. Other shapes and forms milled about. Human forms, he realized with glee. They gathered around a pier and gazed out at a vessel that approached. The vessel was black against the slate gray of the sky. Darkest of all was the helmsman, who steered the vessel directly towards them. Shadowy crew moved about and performed the necessary tasks to make a ship perform. "Think I may be dreaming again," Dmitri mumbled. One of the folks, lined up along the dock, turned to him, feature pale and sallow in the murkiness. The man looked dead, Dmitri decided, but then the lips moved and the words emerged.
"You dream no more, young one. It is indeed Charon himself who arrives to ferry us to the far shore."
"Confirmed. Subject is deceased." Oh man, it was awful. Guardrails split off the entire left side, instant insanguination. Witness said she saw a big red rig that swerved into the lane in front of him. No idea where it went afterwards. Poor guy. Assuming the course that the registered owner was driving could have been someone who borrowed the car. State Trooper Sandra Briggs chattered as part of her means to process the stress. Officer Bill Stratton from the City Police Department laughed as part of his response to the same stressors. Exsanguination. Who are you kidding? You got one fancy dance word from the medical examiner's office. Trooper Briggs eyed him askance. Yep, I did. Point is, he died on impact, or so close as to make no difference. Who gets to notify the family? The red, white, and blue emergency lights flashed and sparkled in the soft rainfall in the background. So quoth, this raven, my darlings, I hope you enjoy this on this weekend of the release of the last Jurassic World movie. I believe it's the last. We'll see. Probably depends on how much it makes this weekend. Anyway, thanks to Michael for the story, and thank you all for listening. It really does mean a lot. I've had a very rough year, and you know what? You guys have always shown up for me. So I hope to get back on track soon. I'm working on it. Anyway, have a lovely, lovely day, my darlings. Bye-bye. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.